You're in the BitFlow track, and our next speaker is Gabi Nakibly. He's going to be speaking on owning the routing table, new OSPF attacks.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So, as he said, my name is Gabi Nakibly, and I'm going to present some new OSPF routing attacks, which allows a remote attacker to remotely control the routing table of another router without actually having to control or own the router itself. This is a joint work with Alex Kirshon and Dima Gonikman. Before I begin, just a quick introduction about myself. So again, my name is Gabi, and I'm a network security researcher at a place called the National Electronic Warfare Research and Simulation Center. It's part of a larger organization called Rafael, which is an aerospace and defense company located in Israel. And our lab does high-end research and consulting services for organizations that want to better defend their information assets and networks. I also serve as an adjunct researcher and lecturer at the Technion. Let's begin with a general overview of what you're going to hear. So I'm going to present today some newly found vulnerabilities in the OSPF protocol, which is probably the most common or popular routing protocol inside autonomous systems. As I said, attacks allow an attacker to remotely own the routing table of another router without actually having to control or own the router itself. This is, of course, very desirable for the attacker since he doesn't have to get remote code execution on the remote router. You just have to execute the attacks I'm going to present. And why is this so desirable to control the routing table? Well, the attacker can do many neat tricks with the routing table. For example, it can divert traffic to non-normal routes. For example, to facilitate eavesdropping, man in the middle, impersonation, blackholing, and so on and so forth. It can also deny of service the entire autonomous system by inducing routing loops, network cuts. It can also deny of service a particular router by overwhelming it with traffic, and so on and so forth. Actually, the examples are endless. An attacker that controls the routing tables of other routers actually control the entire routing of the autonomous system. So, who is vulnerable to this attack? Actually, potentially, every commercial router on the market is vulnerable to the attacks you're going to hear today. This is because the attacks exploit vulnerabilities in the OSPF specification, in the RFC itself. So every router vendor which implemented this, the RFC correctly is vulnerable to these attacks. And indeed, we verified these attacks against Cisco's iOS latest and stable release and found out that indeed Cisco implemented the vulnerabilities correctly. So how the attacks actually work and why they are so different from known OSPF attacks you may already know. Okay, so the attacks achieve control over the routing tables of another router by falsifying or controlling the router's view of the autonomous system's topology. This can be done by falsifying the routing advertisements of other routers in the autonomous system. The routing advertisements of other routers are used to compile the view of the autonomous system topology. So known attacks that attempted to do this, to falsify the routing advertisements of other routers, usually encountered or triggered the fightback mechanism of OSPF. This is a relatively famous mechanism in OSPF, which says that if a victim router noticed that its routing advertisement has been falsified, it will immediately spit out a correcting routing advertisement which will cancel out the false one. So this means that all or practically most of known attacks that try to do this were non-persistent. The new attacks I'm going to present today evade this fightback mechanism and allow for persistent and stealthy attacks. Okay, so let's dive into the presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the OSPF basics. then point out the security strengths of OSPF, and why does it make the life of the attacker so much hard. Then the known OSPF attacks that already been published in the past, and then for the main course, the newly found vulnerabilities and attack. Okay, so let's start with the big picture, internet routing, how it works. Well, the internet is composed of networks and routers. The networks and routers are clustered into groups, which are administered by a single network operator, for example, a university, an ISP, a large corporation, and so on and so forth. These clusters, these groups are called autonomous systems. There are some 35,000 autonomous systems scattered throughout the internet. And now this means that if I want to route a packet from A to B on the internet, the routing has to work in two levels. The first level is the inter-AS path, which means I have to work out the path the packet will take at the AS level, the list of autonomous systems the packet will traverse. This is done by an inter-AS routing protocol, which is commonly known as BGP. And the lower level is the routing inside each and every autonomous system, which is done independently. This is done by intra-AS routing protocols, the most prominent examples of which are OSPF, RIP, and ISIS. As I said, I'm going to focus on OSPF, which is probably the most common routing protocol, intra-AS routing protocol on the internet, certainly for enterprises. So how OSPF works? Let's see an example. Let's say this is our autonomous system. We have a bunch of routers and networks connected to each other to form a certain topology. Now OSPF works by having the routers periodically advertise routing advertisements, which we call link state advertisements, or LSA for short. And in each LSA, the router tells us to which other routers or networks is directly connected. And this LSA is flooded throughout the autonomous system. So, for example, the LSA of RA is flooded throughout the network. Now, every router builds a data structure called the LSADB, which simply stores all the LSA it receives. So now every router knows that RA is connected on one interface to net 1 and to the other to net B, to RB. Same goes for RB, flooded throughout the autonomous system, and now everybody knows that RB is connected to RA and these two other routers, and so on and so forth. This is how every router forms its view of the autonomous system topology. Now, in addition to the links, there are also costs associated with each and every link. This means that RA tells us that it's connected to RB and the cost is 3, and the cost from RB to RA is 2. Based on this view and these costs, the router now calculates the least cost path from it to each and every other destination on the autonomous system, and this is how a routing table is constructed. Okay, now let's talk about some LSAs. Now, as I said, the LSAs are periodically advertised. This means that a fresh instance is originated by default every half an hour. So in order for a fresh instance to run over an older instance, we use the sequence number. There's a sequence number in each LSA, and this is how a new instance of an LSA with a higher sequence number can run over an old instance of an LSA with a lower sequence number. And there also is an age field to the LSA, which means that the age is initialized by 0 and then continuously incremented as time goes by. And when the age reaches 1 hour, the LSA is removed from each and every database. Okay. And one other thing is the advertising links on a LAN. Now, OSPF defines the following procedure for advertising links to a LAN. Each router first advertises a link to the LAN itself, not to other routers which are connected to it. And in addition to that, one router is named the designated router of the LAN, and it advertises another LSA on behalf of the network itself, which advertises links back to all the other routers that are directly connected to the network. And this is how advertisements on a LAN, this is a transit network, works out. Okay, so now how can a router know who are its neighbors? Well, there is a simple protocol called the hello protocol, which defined as part of the OSPF protocol. And this is a fairly simple protocol that, in which every router just advertises or broadcasts an hello message on the local LAN. And this is how routers mutually discover each other. Now, two neighboring routers, which have now discovered each other, possibly can now set up an adjacency between them. The purpose of an adjacency is to make sure that the two routers have the exact same copies of the LSA of their LSA DBs. And now, not every two neighboring routers set up this adjacency, only if one of them is a designated router or if they are connected over a point-to-point link. And after they've set up an adjacency, they can now include in their LSA a link to the other router. Let's see an example of how setting up an adjacency works out. So we have these two routers, R1 and R2. They initially don't know one about the other. And R2, for example, sends out the initial hello. It broadcasts it on the local link, and the R1 receives this broadcast. And then when he sends its hello, he's claiming that he previously seen an hello from R2. This is indicated in the neighbor field. And let's say for our purposes that the identity of R1 is numerically larger than the identity of R2. Now, once R2 sees this hello, let's assume that he decides to set up an adjacency. For example, if R2 is the designated router. Now, as I said, the purpose of setting up an adjacency is to make sure that the LSA DBs of both routers have the exact same LSA DB. Okay, the exact same identical. They are identical. This is done by exchanging the LSA summaries in each and every database. One router tells the other what are the LSAs in its database. And now they exchange the LSA summaries using a special packet called the database description packet. The first sequence of or first exchange of this database description packet is called the master-slave negotiation. This is the initialization. You see here that R2 sends to R1 a database description with an I flag set. This means this is an initialization of the master-slave negotiation. The M flag means that I have more LSA summaries to send out. And the MS flag, which is the most important here, means that R2 declares himself to be the master of the exchange. I will talk about it later, what does it mean to be the master of the slave. And then it chooses just an initial sequence number for the exchange. R1 does the same. Also sends out his database description with an IM and MS flag set, meaning that he is also declaring himself to be the master, and he picks a totally different initial sequence number. Now, since in this example, R1 has a higher identity than R2, this means that R1 is now chosen to be the master, and R2 concedes to be the slave. And this means that now the sequence number chosen by R1 is used throughout the exchange. And now R2 sends out another database description echoing the same sequence number R1 chose. And then R1 proceeds with the exchange by sending his database description with an incremented sequence, and so on and so forth. This continues until both routers tells the other one all their LSA content, all their LSA database content. Once they are finished doing that, they can now see and understand if the peer has a newer LSA than they got. If this is the case, they can ask for, from the peer the LSA by the LSA request, and they can get it back using the LSA update. Once this stage is over, now both routers have the same copies of the LSA DB, okay, and they are fully adjacent. This means that R2 can now advertise an LSA with a link to R1, and R1 advertises an LSA with a link to R2. Okay, this is very important. Let's move on to OSPF security strength. One minute time. Okay. The first security strength is the per link authentication, which means that every OSPF packet which is transmitted over a local link is authenticated using HMAC based on MD5. This is based on a secret shared by all the routers connected to that link. This means that if I want to send out a packet on the link, I have to know this shared secret. Since OSPF did not define an automatic procedure to manage these secrets, network administrators are forced to configure these secrets manually in each and every router, which means that in many deployments in autonomous systems, these secrets are the same for all the links in the autonomous system, but it doesn't have to be that way. Another security strength is that each and every LSA is flooded throughout the network. This means that a single malicious router cannot stop, cannot block, or prevent an LSA from being flooded to other routers, as long as there is another path that doesn't go through that router, this malicious router. Okay, so in the general case, a malicious router cannot prevent an LSA from ever reaching other routers. The third strength is the fightback mechanism I mentioned earlier. If a router receives an LSA that it is its own and it sees that it is falsified, it will immediately send out a fightback LSA, which means a correcting LSA with the right content, with a higher sequence number, and this cancels out the false LSA. Now, notice that the two security strength here actually mean that it is very hard for an attacker to persistently falsify the LSA of another router. If he just sends out the LSA over the network, because of the second bullet, the LSA will eventually be received by the victim router, and this router will immediately send out a fightback LSA, which will immediately revert things back to their normal state. So the attack is not persistent. Another security strength is that one LSA holds only a small part of the topology. This means that even if an attacker somehow managed to persistently spoof or falsify the LSA of another router, it only managed to falsify only a small part of the autonomous system topology. And hardly means that he gained significant control over the router's view of the autonomous system topology, and it hardly means that he gained significant control over the routing table of the victim routers. In order to do that, he has to falsify many LSAs by many routers. And the last strength is that links must be advertised by both ends. This is the bidirectional requirement, which means that if a link is just advertised by a single end, and not the other end of the link, then the link will not be taken into account during the routing table calculation of the other routers in the autonomous system. This means, for example, that an attacker that simply advertised the link to another router will not get any influence on the routing table calculation because that other router will never advertise the opposite direction of that link. Okay, so this were the security strengths of OSPF. And let's talk about the attacker. Now, the attacker is assumed to be somewhere in the autonomous system. It doesn't have to be in a certain location, or it doesn't have to be very central, or well connected. We assume that the attacker is somewhere on the autonomous system within an arbitrary location. This means that it knows the MD5 secret of its directly attached links and only them, and not the other shared secrets of all the other links in the autonomous system. And the goal, as I said, is to control the routing tables of all the other routers in the autonomous system without having to actually control that routers. So before I present the new attacks, let's review some of the known attacks. Okay. Let's review some of the known attacks. The first class of attack, which is the most common attack on OSPF, is the one that attacker simply advertises LSA on behalf of the router it actually controls. This is a very convenient attack vector since no fightback will ever occur. But this is also, oh, sorry. Pause it. How much time again? Snooze for now. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is a very limiting attack vector since actually one LSA is falsified by the attacker, and that's it. So one variant of the attack is actually to falsify the cost of an existing link to another neighbor. This is, of course, kind of limited. It doesn't get the attacker very far. It can, for example, make the cost very high in order to repel traffic from it, or make the cost very low in order to attract more traffic to it, but that's it. The two other variants of the attack, of this class of attack, is to advertise non-existing links to networks outside the autonomous system, or to stub networks inside the autonomous system. A stub network is a network with only one router connected to it. So no fightback can occur here. So these two variants are actually one-track tools, meaning they are excellent if the attacker wants to attract traffic to it. But this is pretty much all the attacker can do. It can impersonate maybe other routers, black hole traffic, but it really will not have a flexible control over the routing tables of other routers. This is not exactly what we want to do. And plus, if the attack is discovered, then it is very easy for the network administrator to pinpoint the attacker, since all the traffic is attracted to him. Another variant of the attack is to advertise non-existing links to transit networks or existing routers. Transit network is a non-stub network, meaning more than one router is connected to it. This variant of the attack doesn't even influence the routing tables because of their bidirectional requirement. The existing router or the designated router of the transit network will never advertise a link back to the attacker. So actually the requirement is not met, and the routing table calculation is not influenced whatsoever. Another class of known attacks is falsifying other routers' LSAs. This is a much more powerful attack. Known examples are sequence ++, meaning let's advertise an LSA with a higher sequence or with the maximum sequence. All these attacks amount to pretty much the same consequence. The victim router eventually triggers the fightback LSA, which makes the whole attack non-persistent and not very stealthy. There is one attack that managed to evade fightback. In this attack, the attacker simply sends out a high rate of the false LSAs, once every 1 or 2 or few seconds, relatively high rate. And it actually exploits a vulnerability in the OSPF specification that mutes the victim router by sending this high rate of false LSA, and the router simply cannot send out his fightback LSA. But this is not very stealthy attack. You have to send every second the false LSA. Another category of phantom routers, attacks is impersonation of phantom routers, of non-existing routers in the autonomous system. in which case the attacker simply sends out an LSA on behalf of a router that does not really exist in the autonomous system. This is good actually for just overwhelming the database of other routers with garbage LSAs, and that's it. It's not really good for changing or influencing the routing table of other routers, again, because of the bidirectional requirement. The phantom router can advertise a link to another router, but that other router will never advertise a link back to the phantom. Okay. So in summary of the known attacks, it is the common conception today that even if the attacker is inside the autonomous system, and let's say that he knows each and every shared secret in the autonomous system, it can't really influence the routing tables of other routers. It can't really influence or falsify the LSA of other routers in a persistent way. It can do a lot of bad things. It can induce instability in the autonomous system, but it can't really cause damage in a persistent way. The new attacks you're going to hear today actually shatters these conceptions and indeed achieve a persistent effect. Okay, so the new attacks are actually two attacks. The first attack is a remote false adjacency attack, which makes the router which makes another router advertise a non-existing link to a non-existing router in its LSA. Again, in a persistent way. This is the first attack ever that managed to do that, to make another router advertise a non-existing link. This attack assumes that all the MD5 shared secret in the autonomous systems are equal. This, in many cases, it is the case, but it doesn't have to be that way. The other attack, it's a much more powerful attack. We call it the disguised LSA. Here, the attacker can falsify the entire LSA of another router, not just make him add another link to a non-existing router, but simply falsify it from scratch. And it does not assume anything about the MD5 shared secrets. Okay. So let's begin with the remote false adjacency attack. This attack is based on the following observation. A master router can successfully set up an adjacency with its peer without actually seeing the messages sent by the peer, the slave router. This is derived from this section in the RFC. And let's see how an attacker can exploit this vulnerability. So let's say we have the victim router, which is the designated router on its LAN. Let's say he has two neighbors he already set up an adjacency with. And now the remote attacker can will send out false hello and database description messages directly to the victim router. This is done using a unicast message. Simply send out direct messages to the victim itself. The messages appears as if they came from a phantom router located on the victim's LAN. And this way, the attacker can convince the victim router he had just successfully set up an adjacency with the phantom router. Like so. And this means that from now on, and this is the whole point of the attack, from now on, the victim router will advertise an LSA on behalf of its LAN, on behalf of the network, which connects the network to the phantom router. And this is, again, this is the first attack that managed to do this in a persistent way. Managed to connect a real network back to the phantom router. And now this means that every LSA the phantom router will advertise will be taken into account while the routing table is calculated. And this is the effect, actual effect of the attack. For example, the phantom router can advertise a link to a non-existing subnet, and all the routing table will be, the calculation of them will be taken into account by this, based on this LSA. So let's see how the attack sequence works out. The actual details of the attack. So every packet the attacker now sends has an IP source address of the phantom's IP address. This is just a fictitious IP address, which is part of the subnet of the victim's LAN, okay? And the IP destination of each packet is the actual IP address of the victim. Again, all packets are sent in unicast to the victim. So the first packet is an hello message, in which the attacker is identifying himself as the phantom router. And he wants to make sure that the ID of the phantom router is larger than the ID of the victim. Just arbitrarily choose a larger identity than the ID of the victim. And the attacker claims in this hello that he already seen in the past an hello from the victim. This is indicated in the neighbor field. Now, the victim gets this hello and simply believes it and adds the new neighbor to the list, decides to set up an adjacency with the attacker. Since we assume here that the victim is a designated router, the attack is launched on the designated router, and he starts the database exchange process. And so he sends out his database description packet, claiming to be the master with some initial sequence number. The message will not be received by the attacker since the attack is located remotely, and the message is destined to the phantom's IP address, just a fictitious IP address. So it will not be received by the attacker, but the attacker doesn't really care. He just can send out his database description packet, claiming to be the master. The MS flag is set with a totally different sequence number, not related to the sequence number chosen by the victim. Now, since the attacker chose to himself an ID that is larger than the victim, he will be chosen as the master. This means that the next sequence, for the remaining of the exchange, the attacker will be the master, and the victim will be the slave of the exchange, which means that throughout the exchange, the victim will use the sequence number chosen by the attacker. This is why the attacker doesn't really have to see all the database descriptions sent by the victim. So there are a few points about the database descriptions of the attacker. First, in this attack, we assume that the attacker sends out just empty database descriptions, no LSA summaries. It doesn't have to be that way, but it will make the life of the attacker easier later on, as we will see. And secondly, he has now to know when the victim stops sending or has finished sending its LSA summaries to the phantom router. Now, he doesn't really know when this event occurs, since he actually don't see the database description packets of the victim. But this does not really matter. It does not have to pinpoint exactly the exact time in which the victim finished sending out all its LSA summaries, because he just have to upper bound this number, the number of database descriptions which are used by the victim. If he overshoots this number and assumes he needs more database description packets than he actually needs, then the victim will just keep sending database descriptions packets which are empty. So it doesn't really matter when the actual point in which the victim finished sending all its LSA summaries. So the attacker can just simply upper bound this number. By the way, note that the attacker and the victim reside on the same autonomous system, so pretty much the LSA database of both are pretty identical. So this means that the attacker can reasonably or approximately know how many database descriptions the victim will need in order to send all its LSA summaries. But again, this upper bound doesn't have to be precise. So let's say this upper bound, the number of database descriptions are sent by the attacker. For example, it shows N. So he sends out the last database description packet. Notice that the M flag is down here. And now, once the victim gets this message, we assume that already he sent out all the LSA summaries he needed. So he sees that actually the phantom router now has an empty database of LSAs. Okay, doesn't bother him. But the point here that he doesn't really now have to ask from the phantom new LSA that he might receive, that he wants to receive. So this means that at this point, this exact point, the victim will now enter the full state, meaning he has completed the adjacency with the phantom router, and he now thinks that he is fully adjacent with a phantom router that does not really exist on the network. And at this point, the victim will now send out LSA on behalf of the network that connects it back to the attacker. Okay, now let's see some possible applications of this attack and what can be done by the attacker itself using this tool. Let's say this is our autonomous system. We have the attacker up there, and we have a subnet down here. And let's say the attacker's goal is to black hole the entire traffic in the autonomous system destined to this subnet. So let's see what the attacker can do. For example, now we can set up a phantom router on the left side of the autonomous system. Oh, this is the normal routes to the subnet. So now we can set up the phantom router on the left side of the autonomous system, while having this phantom router advertise an LSA that as if it was connected to this stub network. And now all the routers which are closer to the phantom router will reroute the traffic to the phantom, meaning that actually the traffic will be black holed. Now, the routers on the right side are not affected, but this can be handled very easily by setting up another phantom router on the right side of the autonomous system. And the attacker can just move on and set up more and more phantom routers on the autonomous system at will, as needed, until all the autonomous system traffic destined to this subnet is black holed. Now, notice that a few things. Well, first, the attacker is not linked to the crime scene. The attacker does not reside on the left side, the network on the left side. It does not reside on the network on the right side. So the network administrator will have a pretty much a hard time to pinpoint the attacker. In addition to that, this attack is totally flexible. At the same ease, he set up a phantom router, he can just tear it down and make him disappear. And for example, make the phantom router appear for half a minute, and then tear it down and set up another phantom router somewhere else in the autonomous system, and then tear it down and after half a minute, and so on and so forth. So this is a very flexible attack in which the attacker can play around with the traffic and actually make the network administrator pretty crazy. Let's see even another potential application which is even more powerful. Now, what if we set up a phantom router and connect it, the same phantom router, to do networks which are in opposite sides of the autonomous system, like this. Suddenly, the phantom router now looks like a very desirable shortcut in the autonomous system, as if it was a wormhole in the autonomous system, and now a lot of traffic will be diverted through it and actually black holed. And this is a very powerful attack. We simulated the attack on real ISP topologies and found out that if the attacker chooses wisely the networks the phantom router will be connected to, it can actually black hole more than 50% of the traffic in the autonomous system. Just 50% of the traffic in the autonomous system will disappear by this simple attack, and that's it. Again, as before, the attacker is way up here. It does not reside on the left side a network nor on the right side network. It is very hard for the network administrator to pinpoint the attacker. So this was the attack. Now, there are some assumptions and caveats to this attack, which makes it a little weaker. First, as I said, the attacker, we assume that the attacker assumes that all the shared secret on the autonomous system is equal. This is indeed the case for many autonomous systems, but it doesn't have to be that way. We have to assume that since the packets sent by the by the attacker to the victim router are sent in a unicast way explicitly to the victim. So we have to know the shared secret on the remote link that is attached to the victim. Another caveat is that the adjacency must be maintained every 40 seconds. If we want to make the attack persistent for more than 40 seconds, we have to send out another hello message, which means that in order to let the victims know that the phantom is still alive. This is done just every 40 seconds. The hello message is pretty much the same first hello message you've seen in the attack sequence. And the last caveat is that once the victim receives an LSA, he now floods it to all its neighbors. That includes the phantom LSA, the phantom router. And he expects now an acknowledgement, but the phantom isn't there to be received, to send this acknowledgement. So the acknowledgement will never be, in a minute, will never be received by the attacker, by the victim. In principle, this attack does not make any, this caveat does not make any difference, since the victim router simply will send out the LSA endlessly and retransmit the LSA to the phantom router. That's it. But however, we noted that in Cisco router gives up after 125 seconds and then tears down the adjacency. Now, there is a possible solution to this caveat, since the attacker itself resides on the same autonomous system. So if the attacker receives an LSA, so it can safely assume that the LSA has been received by the victim, or will be shortly received by the victim. Now that means that it can send out, it has a window of 120 seconds to send out an acknowledgement on behalf of the phantom router. Yes, there was one question there. Yes.
Typically, aren't LSAs generated with a TTL of 1 and not ever forwarded via a router in transition? I mean, OSPF, you would never see a routed LSA happen on a network except for tax links.
Okay, so how does this affect the attack?
Well, to pinpoint the attack, I can see in transmission an LSA route on the router instead of just being layer 2 adjacent.
There is no in this attack. I haven't sent LSA remotely here, at least here. Okay, so. Doesn't really affect here the attack.
If an ACL is configured on the network to block forwarding of the LSA, would it prevent that attack?
Here, no. Again, because no LSAs are sent remotely. Okay. So let's now continue with the much more powerful attack, which is named the disguised LSA. Here, the vulnerability is as follows. Two different instances of an LSA are considered identical by the router if they have the same exact fields. The sequence number, checksum, and age, where the age has a plus or minus 15 minutes range. And the actual payload is not considered. This means that if there are two different LSAs with totally different links in them, they can be still considered by a router identical if they have this same three fields, the checksum, sequence number and age. That's interesting, and let's see how an attacker can exploit this vulnerability. The attacker can advertise a false LSA on behalf of a victim router while disguising the false LSA to a valid LSA. This has the remarkable benefit that if the victim router will now get this disguised LSA, it will simply ignore it and regard it as a duplicate of the valid LSA he recently originated. So no fightback. That's a very good thing for the attacker. But there is a problem with this naive implementation of the attack, since all other routers will also regard this disguised LSA to be a duplicate of the victim of the valid LSA. So therefore, they will not install the disguised LSA in the database, so no effect. So we have to solve this problem. And the solution is that the attacker will send out an LSA that is disguised on behalf, that is disguised to the next valid instance of the LSA. Okay, to the next valid instance, not the current one. So if, in principle, we can send out the disguised LSA just flooded throughout the network, then all the routers will install the LSA since it is disguised to the next valid instance of the valid LSA. And if simultaneously the next valid instance will be also sent out, then when the disguised LSA will reach the victim LSA, it will regard it as a duplicate, and it will not, and no fightback will ever occur. Now, this is kind of complicated. It sounds very complicated. How do we know when exactly the next valid LSA will be transmitted, and you have to send it at exactly the same time? It sounds very, but there is a solution to this problem. What if we can trigger the next valid instance of the attack of the victim of the valid LSA to be originated using a fightback? This is the really easy solution to this problem. Just trigger the next valid instance. So let's see an example of how the attack can work. This is just an illustration, a simple toy example of the attack, just to let you know the basics of the attack. But I will show you in the next few slides a more realistic, practical approach to this. This is how just just to show you the principles of the attack. So let's say we have two routers, the victim and its neighbor R2. So the remote attack can send out an LSA. This is, at this point, indeed, the LSA is transmitted unicast in remote way to the victim router. But as we will next see in the next slide, it does not have to be that way, and we'll show you this in the next slide. So let's say for these purposes, for this simple example, a spoofed LSA, a false LSA, is sent out directly to R1. This is called the trigger LSA, which the sole purpose of it is to simply piss off the victim and make him send out a correcting LSA, the fightback LSA. At the same time, the router sends out a disguised LSA of R1, disguised himself to the future fightback R1 is about to send out, which having the same sequence, checksum, and age of the future fightback. Now, when the trigger LSA is received by R1, it will immediately send out a fightback LSA, which will be received by R2, and it will reject it as a duplicate of the disguised LSA just received. At the meantime, simultaneously, R2 will also will reflood the disguised LSA to all its neighbors. This includes the R1, and R1 will get the disguised LSA, and again will reject it as a duplicate of the fightback it just originated. So at this point, we actually have a persistent state in which R1 and R2 now possesses two different copies of R1 LSA. R1 having the valid content, the valid LSA, and R2 having a totally different LSA. And this, again, this state is persistent. No more fightbacks, and it just remains that way. Okay, so let's review how an attacker can craft this disguised LSA. The first step is to make the edge field the same. This is the easiest one. We just have to make sure that the disguised LSA is sent out within a 15-minute time range of the fightback LSA. This is, of course, very easy to do, and this is done. The next one is the sequence number. Again, very easy, because we know that the sequence number of the fightback LSA is also always incremented by 1 as compared to the trigger LSA. This means that we have to send out the disguised LSA with a sequence number that is incremented by 1 as compared to the trigger LSA. Again, very easy. The hardest feat here is to make sure that our disguised LSA has the same, computes to the same checksum as the fightback LSA, as the future fightback LSA. But this is not that hard because first you have to realize that the content of the fightback LSA is predictable and deterministic. So actually, since all the links of the victim usually remains the same, they are not changed very rapidly, and also the header of the LSA is also very predictable, this means that the checksum of the fightback LSA is also very predictable. So we know how to compute the target checksum value. This is the first stage. So how do we actually make our disguised LSA be computed to the checksum? So we take the false LSA we want to transmit. We add to it a dummy link entry. And the purpose for this dummy link entry is to set its content in such a way that the entire checksum of the LSA will be computed to the target checksum we want it to. Now, this can be done very easily, since remember, the checksum is only a 16-bit result of a linear calculation, and the link entry has some 64 bits of free bits that we can freely set. And they can be anything. So we can actually calculate backward from the checksum, from the target checksum, what is the desirable content of this dummy link entry. Or if you are not that good in math, you can just brute force it. It's only 16 bits. Just try a lot of values for the link entry, and just within 2 or 3 seconds, you will eventually get this checksum. So we have now the disguised LSA having the same exact age, sequence, and checksum as the future fightback. Okay, so now let's see some realistic application of this attack. Let's say now that the attacker is up there and the victim is down there. And now the attacker wants to spoof or falsify the LSA of that victim. Again, in a persistent way that will last very long. And now the attack is simply the following. The attacker will flood the trigger LSA, and after it will flood the disguised LSA on its local link. It will not send it unicastly, but just on its local link. So notice that the trigger LSA will be marked in black, and the disguised LSA will be marked in red. So here it goes. So the attacker will trigger now the two LSAs. Here you see the trigger, and then after it, the disguised LSA. As the trigger makes its way flooded throughout the network, the trigger is installed in the database of each and every router. After it comes the disguised LSA, because he has a higher sequence number. The disguised LSA will run over the trigger LSA, and it will also be installed in the router's database. All the red routers you see here actually installed the disguised LSA. Now, at this point, the trigger LSA is received by the victim, which means it will now spit out the fightback LSA to all its neighbors, like so. Meanwhile, the victim will now receive the disguised LSA. And this means that and it will simply ignore it and trigger it as a duplicate of the fightback it just sent. Meanwhile, the fightback will be received by these two routers up there. And these two routers will also ignore the fightback because it is a duplicate, supposedly a duplicate, of the disguised LSA they just installed in their database. So we have here a persistent state in which the attacker falsified an LSA of another router in a persistent way, without actually causing the fightback to be flooded throughout the network. Now, I would like to point out that the trigger as well as the disguised LSA are flooded locally in the autonomous system, on the local link of the attacker. This means that it doesn't really have to know any of the shared secrets of other links, or maybe an ACL of another router will stop him. This is not the case. Just a regular flooding of an LSA. Now notice here that the attacker does not always manage to poison all the routers in the autonomous system. For example, this router down there was not poisoned. This is because every path from the attacker to that router traverses the victim. So the attacker cannot manage to get to this router. In practice, we have actually a race between the disguised LSA and the fightback LSA. The LSA which reaches first to a router wins. The second one will be regarded as a duplicate, which means that the disguised, if the attacker wants to poison a lot of routers, he has to make sure that the disguised LSA reaches it before the fightback. Now, in this race, the attacker has the upper hand. The disguised LSA has the upper hand. Notice that the disguised LSA was triggered way before the fightback LSA. So indeed, it has a lot of time to propagate in the network before the fightback LSA is originated. So and indeed, we simulated this attack on real ISP topologies, and in almost 100% of the cases, the attacker is able to poison the LSA of a victim router for more than 80% of the other routers in the autonomous system, which is a pretty high number. And this way, the attacker can just falsify the LSA of all the other routers in the autonomous system and actually get a complete control over the routing process in the autonomous system just from a single router, and that's it. So validation of the attacks. As I said, the attacks are actually based on a theoretical analysis of the OSPF protocol, but we verified it successfully against Cisco's iOS 15.01m, which is the latest stable release of iOS on a 7200 series router. And the proof of concept scripts should be in your conference CD. It's written in Scapy, so have fun with it and play with it and disguise the LSA with it. So to conclude, the common conception until now was that a router, an attacker inside the autonomous system, even if he knows the shared secret on the autonomous system, cannot really falsify the routing tables of other routers. As you have seen, these attacks actually shattered this conception. And what it basically means that if an attacker controls a single router, a single arbitrary router in the autonomous system, it actually controls the router the routing process in the entire autonomous system. This is the whole point of this presentation, to show you that a single attack, a single router can actually control the entire routing in the autonomous system. So, and that's it. Any questions? Oh, yes?
A couple questions. One, so both of these assume that the attacker controls one router within the autonomous system?
Yes.
And then the second one, have you talked to any standards bodies about fixes for this?
Yes, we've approached Cisco and Juniper about this, and they acknowledged the seriousness of the problem, but they said that since this is the actual problem with the RFC, so this is in the hands of the ITF. Yes. I'm sorry, I'm not catching it. Yes, if the OSPF protocol would be different in somehow, to pay attention to this, for example, to pay attention to the content of the LSA, this attack would not exist. Because the router only pay attention to these three fields, we are able to disguise the LSA. This would require a change to the protocol, yes, because and it would require a very delicate change because we want to have it backward compatible to other routers who do not implement this change. So indeed, a protocol change is necessary here, and it has to be worked out in some way to be backward compatible. Yes? No, just not every 15 minutes, just once, and that's it. No more fight back, no more, nothing will ever occur now. The only event in which this reverts the situation, as I said, each router periodically advertised a new fresh instance of the LSA every half an hour. So indeed, after half an hour, the LSA the attack will have to be reinitiated. But this is half an hour, it's a very long time. Yes? Please speak up.
If you're a network administrator and you're experiencing this attack, what would it look like to you if you're not familiar with the attack? And what would it look like to you?
What would it look like? Well, it will look like as if that the router thinks very bizarre things about the autonomous system topology, which are not true. The autonomous system topology is one, and what the router thinks is the other, and it starts doing berserk things with its routing table. The LSADB of the router will not be the correct one. This is the first step you can take. Just take a look at the LSADB and make sure that indeed this is in line, in sync with the autonomous system topology, the real autonomous system topology as you know it. And this is actually the surefire way to know if you've been attacked by this, by the disguised LSA attack. Yes? Actually, I wouldn't know that. No. No. Notice that the fightback is not considered a security event in OSPF, just an operational event. The router, when he sees a false LSA, he regards it as a stale LSA. He might have sent out previously before the last reboot or something. So it generally is not regarded as a security event. But then again, I don't know what Cisco does with its logs. Yes?
So this is regarding the false flag attack. You said there's no requirement.
What attack? Excuse me? False remote adjacency?
Right.
Okay.
So did you say it doesn't require LSA?
It does not require an LSA? Yes. Just hello and database description messages. That's it. Excuse me?
Just the description is not.
Yes, just the hello and database description messages. That's what the attacker sends out. And that's it. Once the attack is finished, now the designated router, the victim, does all the work and now sends out an LSA with a non-existing link to the phantom router. And the LSA of the phantom router does not necessarily have to be unicasted to the victim. It can be just flooded locally by the attacker, and it just propagated throughout the autonomous system. That's it. No unicast LSA here. Again, sorry, again?
So for this attack, it doesn't have to be a router physically connected from...
No, it doesn't have to be a router, actual router. It just has to send out these OSPF messages I shown earlier. It just has, the attacker needs to have the ability to send out these false hello and database description messages, which can be processed by the victim router. That's it. It doesn't have to be a real router. This is just for the purposes of the demonstration here. Yes. This is what I used for to check for the attacks against Cisco. Yes. Just the directly connected MD5 shared secret. Yes, this is. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much.